So for the last couple days, I've made 2 trips to Ohio. One, we still have stuff that we never moved, like when we moved up here 4.5 years ago. So these stories people have told us about those boxes that you'll unpack like 10 years from now, I believe you, because we still have things that we've never brought up. But a lot of what we were bringing up was livestock stuff. And so anyway, so Wendy and I had a training yesterday in Toledo, and so I went ahead and I was like, well, I'll take the kids down, let them see Grandma. She can keep them while we do the training. I can make a trip with some stuff. And then we were going to go down afterwards yesterday and pick them up. Well, long story short, I ended up leaving a little later than I intended. We left Wendy's parents at almost 6:30, and it's a solid 3.5 hours. And so I'm like, geez, this is going to be a really long ride. And so, but as we started, like almost immediately, there's snow started flying, and I hadn't looked at the weather in a few days. I don't know why I trusted a weather forecast from like 3 days ago. That makes no sense, right? It's always changing. But so Wendy, I said, hey, pull up my radar, and she pulls it up, and sure enough, there's this like massive storm coming across into Ohio. We got just a dusting here, but and we have to drive west, straight west, for about an hour before we head north on 75. And so I'm like, great, it's starting to snow already, and we're heading into the mouth of the beast. Hoorah, you know? And I think, okay, it's going to be like midnight. And in the midst of this, in the conversation, actually, I think mistake, Julie Aller called my wife. And she's like, throws this out, like, Julie, pray, we're hitting some snow. And I don't know if you did. You did. I thought you did. We're praying, and the snow stops. I'm like, well, this is cool. Like, so I'm flying. Which you should be careful with Michigan plates in Ohio. I think I'm going to try, like, I need to keep like an Ohio State cap. Like, sir, I'm really from Ohio originally. But, you know, I'm being careful. I'm like, man, I'm going to get as far as I can before we hit the snow again. And Wendy pulls up the radar as we're praying, and it was like dissolving in this little circle around us. And it was this wild thing. And it was like as we went, it just kept going. And we had dry roads from 5 minutes after she asked Julie Aller to pray until we hit 21 in North Avenue. And then it started snowing. But it reminded me, we find ourselves often in circumstances that we have absolutely no control over, right? I don't know about you, but I find myself often in these places where I'm like, all right, I ain't got nothing. I mean, you know, that situation, Lord, I've got nothing. If it starts snowing like it's supposed to according to that radar, I'm going to be 6 hours coming home. They might not like my sermon because I'm going to be up here like, hey, y'all, how you doing? Apparently that lab, maybe I do that normally. I don't know. And God did something cool. And so part of what we're going to talk about this morning as we dive back into Nehemiah is those times when we don't have control, when we have to trust that God breaks through. But we're going to start on a high note. If you want to turn with me to Nehemiah, we're going to be at the end of chapter 6, moving into the front of 7. And so that's where we're going to be. You can follow along on the Bible app, the YouVersion Bible app as well, and all the things are on there. So Nehemiah 6, starting in verse 15, tells us this. It tells us, so the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. Now, we know construction in Michigan, right? When I came here, y'all say, yeah, we got 2 seasons up here. It's winter and orange barrel season, right? Yep. Anybody disagree with that? Because I'd like to know where you live. Now, I will say, the further north you live, like Ray Township, the roads are a little better, a little less construction. Just throwing that out there. But it's construction, and we understand. And one of the things that blows my mind is how long it takes for us in all of our modern technology, right? How long it takes us to do something. The bridge on 75 going down on the south side of Detroit, what the name? The Rouge Bridge. It's been closed for what, over a year? 2 years? 2 years it's going to be closed. That's frustrating because I go 75 south to see our family. And so I got to do this, the loop around and stuff. And I remember watching on the news, it was last year, the year before, they were talking over in Troy, some expansion to 75. And I remember what blew my mind as a newscaster, stone-faced, is like, yeah, and the plan projection for this is 14 years. And I went, what? And I don't think this is an Ohio, Michigan thing. I think it is a matter of where we live and what they have to work around. But what blew me away is I thought, well, Ohio had this in 71, this expansion project where they added a lane to 71 for like 80 miles, and they did that in 10 years. And I thought, wow, and then they were talking about like a 4-mile stretch over there. But the reality is construction takes a long time. And so even with today, we have to look at that and say they built a wall around a city in 52 days. Let's be honest. The city hasn't even passed the permits if we start into something like that in 52 days. We're fighting something out, The city's had us change our blueprints 7 times by then, and we just want a wall, But they didn't have that, and they laid into it, and in 52 days, and it says, and when our enemies heard of it, all the nations around of us were afraid, and fell greatly in their own esteem. For they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. And so one of the first points as we talk about, this is I'm calling this, in a way, lessons from the mountaintop. This is a great time. When we complete something for the Lord, we're excited. I have 3 lessons from the mountaintop. The first is this. Truly great kingdom work only occurs when people see that God was involved. Do you get that? We can do amazing things together. I mean, people banding together, it's amazing. But only truly great kingdom work occurs when we know God was involved. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to illustrate this, and so I actually have a challenge this morning. I have a rope up here. I don't know why people assume I'm lynching that. No. Mike was afraid I was going to lynch him. I don't know why I would do that. I want to challenge any guy in this room to a round of tug of war. Who's up? The only one, there's one I'm scared of in here. I'm looking at him. Anybody want to take me on? Huh? Take on the pastor? One-on-one. Oh, Mike is going to take me on. All right. Mike, you can back up there a ways. You ready? Oh, my. He's going to. Now, I have to say this. Mike's you're a stout little fella. And, all right. You ready, Mike? Oh, you guys say go. Ready? Go. I'm going to get you, Mike. See, y'all make fun of me for being a farm boy. Now, he's been sick. That's the only reason, Mike, the only reason. Now, it isn't much to say, no offense to Mike, it's not much to say that I beat him. I am a younger guy. I have a little bit of beef to me. It's all muscle. I'm in a shape. It's called round. But it's not that odd. Now, if I asked and Bethany got up here and took me on, and she won, y'all would be pretty impressed, right? Well, first of all, you'd be like, all right, he let her win. Because that's what you do with your kids. You let them win. Sometimes. No. Some of you are like, no, man, I pulled them through the mud and everything when we played tug of war. But if she won, you would assume something is up, right? Because it doesn't work for her to win. If Mike would have beat me, maybe you're like, well, Pastor's didn't eat his Wheaties this morning or something. But if Bethany would beat me, you'd be like, all right, he's cheating or something, he's letting her win. Because you know it's not possible. And when we talk about the work of the kingdom of God, I think there are times when God calls us to step out on faith and be in a place where the people looking on say, you know what, that is not even remotely possible but God, right? We talked about that in our Deeper Life conference. And so what we see in Nehemiah's case here is the people were afraid. Their esteem dropped. They had been all pompous. They had been making fun of them. They had been just threatening to come in and kill them. And now they're scared. Why? Because they know there's a God in Jerusalem. What if we were doing things in such a way that our community around us looked over there and said, you know that little church in the woods? There's a God there. Radically changes things. And that's what we see. Truly great kingdom work. I'm not downing. I mean, there's times when God calls us together and he allows us to really be a participant and do some cool things. But if people can't see God's hand, I would argue it's not truly great kingdom work. Psalm 127:1, I've already quoted in this series. It says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. We have to, as a people of God, come to the realization that I truly cannot do anything of significance without him. It's not about us and what we can do. Good scriptural example of this. It's found in 1 Kings chapter 18. I'm just going to summarize a little bit here. We know this is the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. You remember the story? So there's all these false prophets going around and they think they're tough stuff. Elijah goes up against how many? Do you remember? 400 and... I thought it was 450. I just read it this morning. 450. 450 men. And they set up a couple altars, and he proposes this to the people. He said, let's prove who is really God. And he says, you know what? You all set up your altar. You put your bull and your offering on it. I'll set up my altar and my bull and stuff. And the one whose God sends fire, that is the one who's real. And the people are like, yeah, we like this, right? It's a little show and tell. Are you really real? And so they do that. And we know that the prophets of Baal, they go on and go on and go on for hours. They're beating themselves. They're cutting themselves. And Elijah, he likes to get a little dig in once in a while. And he tells them, he says, cry aloud, for he's a god. Either he's musing or he's relieving himself. I'm sorry, that's funny. He's on the can, people. That's what he said. Hey, you're God. Maybe he's on the can. Knock a little harder on the door. Not one knock, not two knocks. Give it three. And he says, or maybe he's on a journey, or he's asleep and must be wakened. He is taunting them something terrible. And we know after this that Elijah prays. Well, first of all, he has them dump a bunch of water on his altar. Now, I have a fireplace, and I know the pain of wet wood. It just doesn't catch fire easy. And he has them pour water on it, and then pour water on it, and pour water on it, and it fills this trench around it, and then God sends fire down. It consumes the offering, the altar, and the water. And he's on a mountaintop, right? And the people turn, and actually those 450 false prophets, they kill them. Now, we don't operate like that anymore. But it shows us the heart of God towards people who believe in other gods. He's a jealous God, and he wants our worship. And so they killed him. And so we see Elijah and the people, they turn towards God because it was something that he couldn't have done on his own. Simply was. Nehemiah 6 goes on to tell us this. Now we have a little hiccup here. He's just finished the wall. Things are going good, right? It's time for the party. I know we should have a party and a half. You complete a wall that fast, that's a party. It says, moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah. Now, we remember Tobiah, right? He's the bad guy. He doesn't like what Nehemiah is doing. It's messing with his power play. And so he's got some connections, and letters came to him. And at times, Nehemiah here kind of explains the connections. What's going on? Why does this dude seem to have so much influence? So it says, for many in Judah were bound by an oath to him. So he's made some transactions. He's got agreements with people. So he's a powerful guy. Because, well, first of all, he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Uriah. And his son, Jehohanan, had taken also the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, and his wife. What in the world did Nehemiah just said? Well, this powerful person over here, Tobiah, is his brother's cousin's wife's nephew twice removed. Okay? And this powerful person over here in leadership, he is his father's son's nephew's grandma on his mother's side. I don't know. Basically, you have people like this probably in your workplace. Or maybe you have in the past, right? They're the person that, like, they seem to get away from with everything, and you're like, what is going on? And then you find out, like, oh, by the way, his uncle is like the boss, right? Like higher up, maybe not right there, but he's got connections. One of the things I had to sort out when I came here, in a smaller church, is what are all the connections? Man, tankers, y'all like all over the place. It's like, who's that? Well, they're a relative of the tanker. Oh, okay, well, that makes sense. And so, there's connections everywhere. And so in this case, it was a negative thing. This dude's a bad dude, but because he's got so many marital connections, he's got his finger in the pie everywhere, and people are afraid to stand up to him. So, he says, also, they spoke of his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him. You see what's going on? Tobiah's got insiders. In the midst of Nehemiah's inner circle, he's got people be like, you know what, that dude ain't so bad. And then when Nehemiah sets up a plan, they go and tell Tobiah. That's betrayal. That's gossip. It's inappropriate. They do it. And he says, Tobiah sent letters to make me afraid. He's just completed the wall, and Nehemiah records, and now, there's this dude, it's like every person in leadership is his family somehow, and he's got contracts, and he's sending me threatening letters. But everybody keeps telling me how good of a dude he is. It's a frustrating place as a leader. But it points to a greater issue, and that is this. Satan often attacks right after we have arrived. And whatever arrived is. Your goal may be a short-sighted one. It may be a low one. The number one day of the week that pastors struggle with depression and spiritual warfare? Monday. Why? Because Sunday's our big day, right? Some people call it the Super Bowl every Sunday. And in a way it is, like we gear up. And oftentimes, the enemy wants to slide in. Why? Because when we reach our peak, when we've accomplished something, we want to stop and kick back and say, we're done. Right? That's what we do. And actually, we had a leadership meeting, actually a couple years ago now, and we talked about like church life cycles, and churches do this. Every church has this idea in their mind, like, well, this ideal like point where we have X amount of people, we have established leadership, we have finances are not an issue. And churches, up until that point, man, they will lean into what God's doing. They're ready to run. And in the alliance, they call that incline, where, man, they're giving everything they got. But as they approach it, churches will change into what they call recline. We're like, no, we're good. We can relax a little bit. Take the foot off the gas pedal. Let's kick back. You know what happens as soon as they do that? They start to crest and go into decline. And they shrink. Every church. And we talked about as leaders what that looked like for us. I really sensed we were coming out of that. We were in a decline for a long time. But the issue is, when we get there, we think that it's about our rest, that God has gotten us to this point so we can, take a break, right? But the reality is, that isn't what gets happened. Satan sticks his ugly fingers in. When we look at Elijah, in the next chapter in 1 Kings 19, what do we see him doing? He's running for his life. Jezebel don't like that he killed all her false prophets. Even though like fire fell from heaven, she doesn't care. And the man runs for his life, ends up in a cave where God meets him where he is and calls him back into his ministry. But he ends up running. Satan gets in And he tries to attack at that point because we are vulnerable. And the reality is, when we get there, we just stop and we take our guard down. You know, in some of our struggle, like part of, I think, Mondays for pastors, we know we're supposed to take a Sabbath. Man, you go to like a seminar for pastors, like, what do you need to do to be healthy? They make sure you take your Sabbath. You know, they'll hammer that into us. And we know passages like Mark 2:27, which says, and Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And so we take that, and most pastors, been there, on Monday, most of you, right, when you arrive at something, what do? What do you want to do when the work's done? Well, you wondered why there was a recliner on the stage, didn't you? Well, what do? We kick back, right? Now, many of you don't know, this chair is named prayer. And when I'm in my office, if you ever call and Jane says, pastor's in prayer, well, that's where I'm at. I just gave myself away. Man, I'm in trouble now. You're not going to believe that I'm actually praying, are you? But that's what we do. We think that we've arrived to kick back. But I want to point you to something. Now listen, rest, physical rest is really important. I can tell you, almost every Sunday afternoon, I do that exact thing at home. I kick back in my lazy boy, I take a nap. But I want to remind you what the Sabbath was for originally. In Exodus 20, it says, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Now, depending on your posture, some of you may need to hear that. 6 days you shall labor. God gives us rest, but not just rest. 6 days you shall labor. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath, what? To the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your livestock, or your sojourner who is within your gates. Now we know this, for pastors, we take Mondays because, well, I'm sorry, this is not a relaxing vacation every Sunday. Now, maybe y'all are relaxed, but the reality is God set aside the Sabbath because he knew that in the midst of work, we can so easily lose our focus. And he wants us to stop every once in a while and look at him. And the problem is when we get to Sabbath, we don't stop and look at him. Oftentimes, we stop and look at ourselves. Man, that's what I want to do. Now I say, I'm not saying y'all need to get rid of your lazy boys. Prayer is staying in my office. But we have to understand the spirit behind Sabbath. When we reach a point of completion, whether it's our work week, whether it's a really big project, we have to understand Satan is waiting for you to put your guard down so that he can get in and get a dig at you. He will every time. Our enemy prowls around like a roaring lion. He is looking for his opportunity, and the moment you put your guard down, he's there. And so we have to realize that. So in the midst of the mountaintop, don't go, whoo, I can do nothing. You need to be ready because it's probably going to happen. Nehemiah 7, then, turning the corner into the next chapter, says, now when the wall had been built, and I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed. Now, I love Nehemiah because we start to see, this is one of the few books where we see like a really nice picture, like a description of what some of their worship looked like. We see it in other places, but man, they put it together now. I mean, they had the choir going, and they had the instruments, and I mean, it was some big stuff. It was good. They poured themselves in it. They gave their very best, their excellence, and poured themselves out. But his focus here is this. He says, I gave my brother Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem, for he was more faithful and God-fearing man than many. Now, he sets up the worship stuff. He's got some things moving, and we'll see in a little bit, in a couple chapters, we're going to see that they do have a party. They have a party. But he starts to set up some other things. He gets to the mountaintop, and he knows that this is not where I stop and throw myself down in a recliner. He said, I got to keep going. There's other things the Lord has. And so one of the first things he realizes, he needs a God-fearing man to be in charge. Now, I love this passage because he doesn't talk about his brother's administrative skills. He doesn't talk about that, you know what, he can type so many words per minute. Any of you ever lost a job because you couldn't type so many words a minute? I did. I lost it by I don't know, it was like 3 characters a minute or something. I was like, oh. The most important thing he's looking for, he wants a God-fearing man. Because the reality is, if you have someone who's falling hard after Christ, in their weakness, God will be made strong. Now, I'm not saying that, if we want to hire another preaching pastor, that we find somebody who can't speak in public. That's not what I'm saying. But he's saying that the foremost thing he's looking for is a God-fearing man. He's more faithful and God-fearing than many. And I said to them, let not the gates of Jerusalem be open until the sun is hot. Do you understand what he's saying? He said, listen, it's not enough that we have built the wall and they're scared. We have to use the things that God has given us. Some of you have gifts and talents, I know, that are lying dormant in a closet somewhere collecting cobwebs. And he's saying, listen, we have to use it. If we built this thing, God works so we could have it, we have to use it. And so he says, do not open them until the sun is hot. Listen, early morning's a good time for attacks. He said, don't open until it's hot. And while they're still standing guard, let them shut and bar the doors. He said, listen, when it's in the end of the day and their shift's over and it's time to go home, shut the doors first. What you, duh, right? I mean, it's like, hey, before you leave your house, shut the door. You think, right? I mean, picture you live down in Detroit. Do you just walk off and like, oh man, I should go shut the door later today? No. And so what we see here is he says, listen, before your duty's done, close the door. Appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their guard posts and some in front of their own houses. Remember when they built the wall, some of them were built right in front of their house. He's saying, listen, it's important you put them where it matters to them. Like, I think this is a good lesson in how we structure church, that we don't just need warm bodies in roles. We need people in roles who are passionate about that role. These guys are going to be passionate about that part of the wall. Why? Because their house is right there. If an enemy breaks through, the first house that's getting ransacked is their own. You better believe they're going to fight a little harder. And the same thing in church ministry, a person who is passionate about their role and what they're doing, they're going to strive after God in it. But man, if someone fills a role just because they needed a body, that's rough. And I mean, don't blame them, it's rough. And so he says, to set them someone in front of their own houses. The city was wide and large, but the people within it were few. No houses had been rebuilt. And so this starts to open up a can of worms of what the next chapter, or the rest of this chapter is going to look at. Now, you may look at that and see this long list and like, how is the pastor going to use that? I'm going to surprise you next week. But all this to say, my third point from the mountaintop is this. God always has more for us. Always. Think about Elijah. He's running for his life. How does Elijah end his life? Chariot of fire. Man, I don't know about y'all. I want to go out that way. Yeehaw. God always has more. No matter what we've accomplished, we can always look ahead to more that God has for us. More of his love, more depth and walk with him, and more of just getting to partner with him and pushing forward with the kingdom and pushing back the darkness, reaching people for Jesus Christ. Like, he always has more. We've never really arrived. until you really are literally no more use here and you've gone to heaven. Then you've arrived. That's okay. There's a quote that my secretary in my last church always had up in her office. I'm sorry, it's adapted from a guy who wasn't really a good guy, but I like the quote. Life should not be a journey to the grave with the intention of arriving safely in a pretty and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside in the cloud of smoke, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, "Wow, God, what a ride." Now, that's not what he originally said. It was adapted, but I don't know about you. That's the way I want to arrive in heaven. I don't know how old I'll be. None of us know. But man, I want to ride in going, "Whoo! Man, that was something, Lord." And I think that's what we see in the life of Nehemiah. Man, he never lets up. Now, granted, he gets away. You can see, we saw his times of prayer with the Lord. He has times of solitude. But he has a different look at that. God always has more for us. And I think even these 3 points, like the truly great kingdom only occurs when people see that God's involved. Satan often attacks right after we have arrived. God always has more for us. I wanted to even boil it down further. What does this really tangibly look like? And the reality is, I think it actually is really well illustrated up here. When you accomplish something, when you have a moment to let down, and I recognize you need sleep. We did still get home late. I'm still going to take my nap today. But when you have, you've gotten through that and you have some time to yourself, what does it look like? Does it look like this chair and hours of TV? Because the kind of rest that God calls us more to is so much more. I can tell you, when you're sick, you remember when you were a kid and y'all, when you got sick and you got to stay home from school? Did anybody here, ever have the house to themselves? No? Oh, a couple of you? I did. Boy, I watched so much TV. And oftentimes, sometimes my tendency is that if I've got some really downtime, I want to watch some TV or something. Nothing wrong with TV in itself. But the reality is, we have to ask ourselves, what is our resting position? What is our default? Is my default resting position look like that? We're like that, we all have a desire to rest, and I mean we all have a desire for physical rest. But one of the things we went to the training yesterday was peacemaking, Alliance of Peacemaking, and how we address conflict biblically. And one of the things we talked about is when a desire becomes more than a desire. What I'm talking about, when you talk about rest, is your desire for physical rest come to a point of it's no longer just a desire, it's an idol. What I mean by that is it's something you're willing to be disobedient to the Word of God to achieve. Right? Are you willing to go days without touching your Bible for the sake of this kind of resting? Or does your resting position look more like that? I can tell you, now I say, we all need our rest. If you came in here today and you're like, man, I got 3 hours of sleep last night, go get some sleep. There's beeping. But I can tell you, for your soul, the resting position that tends towards this is far more satisfying to your soul. This, before my King, this is where I find rest. That I will give my body some physical rest, yes. But if I want rest for my soul, I set aside time with Him. And I think that's really the story we see with Nehemiah. His rest is found so much there that when he crests the mountaintop, he's still ready to deal with Satan's attacks. And oftentimes I have really wondered, I've seen in people's lives where I've wondered if God is not allowing them that mountaintop because he knows as soon as they do, they're going to crash and burn. What is your resting position?